I come from the side where we think we know the transport industry quite well, but I connected to other researchers at Chalmers who know manufacturing systems and those kind of supply chains much better. If we connect our research, I think we can learn very much. And I think that goes much for the industry as well. If ship owners know more about the design of the supply chains they serve, and if the supply chain managers know more of what transport can provide, then we can get much more efficient solutions.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Welcome to episode 197 of the Shipping Podcast. For the first time since before the pandemic, I had the pleasure of doing an in-person interview with a guest again. It was such a long time ago, I hardly remember how to do it, but it was such a nice time. I went to see Johan Woxenius. He is a professor in maritime transport management and logistics. He works at the School of Business Economics and Law at the University of Gothenburg, and I live close to that university. So I took the tram and went to see Johan, and we had a cup of coffee and a nice chat about supply chains and the future. I hope you will enjoy listening to us. Here is Johan Woxenius for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Johan Woxenius. I'm a professor of maritime transport management and logistics at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden.
And what is your background?
Well, I was trained as an industrial engineer. That was in the 80s, late 80s, when everything was turning upwards and we were more or less supposed to be CEOs, all of us. And then come one of the financial crises. We had a local one here in Sweden and suddenly we had no jobs. So I embarked on an academic career instead, starting as a PhD student and then continued that was at Chalmers University of Technology. And roughly 15 years ago, I got the professorship here at the business school.
And what do you do as a professor?
You might think or hope if you are a taxpayer that we sit and have deep thoughts on things, open-minded and so on, but it's, well, a lot of new public management, raising funds for our research, project management, different assessments and so on. But the questions that I burn for that is putting shipping into a logistics context. How can shipping be one part of the longer transport chains that foster the different trading relationships in the world and how we can make more efficient manufacturing and benefit from the open trade that we love so much.
And how did you fall in love with shipping? I mean, how did you come in contact with the maritime world?
Well, first when I studied at Chalmers, I had a course coming up called logistics. I'd never heard about it. I thought it was another math course, possibly philosophy, something with logics. But then I was more or less sold. I had a very good teacher there, Kent Lumsten, who also wrote the book, and he really burned for logistics. And of course, the part that I was more interested was physical parts of it. So not so much the supply chains and business logistics, warehouses and so on, but how do you actually move things? And how do you move commodities, long distances and so on? So that's something that caught my interest. And then I choose different courses specializing in industrial marketing and in logistics.
And what are the biggest changes that you have seen during your career?
Well, I would say as a scientist, when I started, actually, we had very close relationship to industry. We did, say, conceptual research, new models, and so on. And unfortunately, as I have to come back to this with the projectification of my profession, that we now, for a while, we talked a lot about projects, how we can raise funds, and we sort of managed everything instead of sort of just accumulating knowledge or having the great visions and so on. It was all tied into projects that we needed to fund. And nowadays, unfortunately, we talk more about journal articles and which journals to publish in rather than what are the ideas that we want to develop. But I think this is a pendulum and we'll swing back. I can see already in the US that they had talked so much about these journals. So now they thought about relevance. How can we work with the industry? How can we help society to develop? And that's what I want to do.
Okay. And how has the maritime industry changed during your time?
Well, I first started because at Chalmers I did mostly rail-centric research. It was still intermodal, so of course a lot of semi-trailers, containers and so on. Often one end of the transport chain was in the port or the land-based transport chain. And then when I got the professorship, it was actually rather little, say, business or logistics-related maritime research in Sweden. So that's, I guess, why I got that professorship. But then I came from rail that is so national, both in governance, ownership, and it's dug down into the ground and it's sort of integrated in the public sector. But basically does the same thing as shipping does, moving commodities at a low cost, long distances, early stages often of the supply chains. But it was a totally different industry. They were very private, often family-held industries. You can lose $1 million one day, earn $2 million next day, and so on. So that were the poker players. So that was so similar thing that you do, but so vastly different as an industry. So that was one observation there. And another one was that, because they say, why don't politicians talk to us? Well, say,
The maritime industry.
Yeah, yeah. So they said, yeah, but I try to come a little bit as an outsider, saying, well, you tend not to pay any taxes, you don't want any regulation, and you have rather few voters, actually. So what is the interest from the politician side? I didn't really think about that. But I can see now, 15 years later, it's developed very much. As the organizations around have matured, it's much more integrated in society. It's nothing that just leaves the port and then it's not visible until it comes to the next port. Also, the operational side is very much part of society today.
So the politicians need to understand what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think we've had a lot of troubles the last few years, but it has been visible how dependent we are on international trade. And for international trade to work, we need to move things. And when shipping doesn't work, then it's notable.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have been on the first page of many papers lately for the wrong reasons, in a way.
Yeah. So,
Again.
Yeah. So we've got media attention for the wrong reasons, but it's not because of bad behavior. I would say it would be much worse if it was highlighted the backside of shipping where we ground ships on a beach in, say, Bangladesh and start to cut it up and so on. But now at least it was that the system didn't really work. And the good thing about that is that actually it had worked for many years. So we could rely on it. We could design the supply chains with very little safety stock, buffers and so on, because we simply relied on the ships will come next week as well. But that has been interesting during the pandemic and also before we had a port strike here in Gothenburg. And that what happened was that logistics, shipping is often in the trade pages and in the daily press, but suddenly it was on the news pages where you typically found possibly rail transport, buses, public transport that you find in the news pages, but at the end typically find logistics issues. But now, over the pandemic and with the supply chains, there's been much more awareness, I think, in the society.
And we are in the middle of crisis again. And crisis is always developing into something also good, I think.
Yeah, of course we have to learn from crisis. I had a history of technology teacher at Chalmers. He had a philosophy. He was originally a strength of material professor, and he built bridges. So he said, well, if you look at the history of bridges, you can see a lot of catastrophes. So you start with a very rigid stone bridge, and then you had engineers being a little bit more skilled, and you had architects that should be also looking nice and so on. And then you thought you managed this, and then was a new factor coming in. Could be possibly an earthquake or some other strictly physical phenomena, and then it fell down. And the generation that saw this bridge falling down, they started to build very rigid bridges for their career. But then there were new engineers coming in, thought they were a little bit more clever, they could do better calculations, and you brought in new materials, could be cast iron bridges, and then that fell. And then you had rigid bridges for half a career, and then another set of bridges falling. So learning from this is that everyone who has seen a big crisis, a big catastrophe, they tend to take precautions to avoid it. But if you haven't seen it, you start to look for what are the edges. We can say exactly the same thing in supply chains. So we've had a number of rather stable years now. We could lower the safety stocks, lower the buffers, and we could trade longer distances and so on. And not knowing it really, we created this rather fragile supply chains actually. So now it's a crisis. So now we can teach new things in the lecture halls here, and also those in the industry, they've seen a crisis. So now they can try to avoid the next one, or the consequence of the next one. There will always be new catastrophes, but we might not suffer as much from them.
I listened to you last week when you were at the conference, a speaker there, and you were talking about how crises have changed in the industry. You used to, if something happened, you could understand what will be the consequence of that, but now it's different. Could you please develop on that?
Yeah, if you look back in history, you can see the energy crisis, for instance, that came from the supply side, and the consequence, because we were so addicted to the oil, that went from $1 to $35 a barrel, and then of course had big consequences. But it was sort of the causal relationships were rather clear. And then we've had crises. It could be either stopping international finance during financial crisis, and then it was a demand problem from a shipping perspective. But now it's during the pandemic, it has been a very complex thing, partly because we have created this fragile supply chain. So it's, well, if you have a flat tire in the middle of the night, no one notices. But if it's in the congested hours when people are commuting, then it makes the news. Now, since we've had a little bit of friction, add on. So, for instance, the Suez Canal incident that has happened before, and 1 week is not totally devastating for container shipping. Could be a storm slowing down traffic and so on. But as it was on top of other crises and people waiting for these commodities and the e-commerce that they were waiting for, then it went into the news. But it's just a signal that we have created very complex system, and the reasons and the results of things is a little bit blurred.
Is this common knowledge in the maritime industry or in other industries that we have this complex systems?
Well, I think so. It must be if you're in the industry, and what has happened through the pandemic now and the aftermath, that we might say, because now we at least meet here in Sweden, at least we meet and so on. But we still suffer from the consequences. My car broke down the second day of my vacation, and that was 2.5 months ago. And now they say we have the spare part. I have a new car, by the way, but because I can't wait 2.5 months for a car. But that is, I think, a signal that there are some unbalances in the both manufacturing, trading, and transport systems.
And on top of that, we got the war in Ukraine.
Yes, and that came actually a little bit earlier. The thing that I see now is that we have several concurrent crises. So we have a manufacturing, particularly microchips that are in short supply, would probably be oversupply rather soon after all the investments. We have energy, we have commodities, we have food, and on top of that, transport problems. And what these different segments of society has in common is that we have very long lead times. And I think that most are aware that it takes time to build a container ship, for instance, might be 3 years until delivery. Building a power plant takes years, particularly if you need all the permissions and so on. It could take decades to build a nuclear power plant. We have a microchip thing that is long lead time to build those factories, and immense investments. And that I think we are aware of, that there are no shortcuts. But we also have to be aware that those investments have to live for 25, 30, 50 years if you talk energy. And someone to invest billions and billions need to know that there will be need also not only tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but 20 years in time. So what to invest in now is very difficult, and who is going to invest? And having these different segments working together to create this mess, it's a little bit sad to say, but I don't see it's not a short way out of this crisis, I would say.
So what about this near-shoring thing that everyone is talking about now, that we should produce things closer to our own country or in our own countries and all of that? What are your views on that?
I think we might see a little bit more of regionalization of the supply chains. So we'd like to at least have an alternative supplier, but that you wanted before as well, to have one that can help you out if there is a problem a little bit more nearby. And we could have strategies like buying, if you're on the fashion side, that you bought the the regular clothes, the underwear and so on from Asia, if you take a Swedish or European perspective. And then the little bit more advanced fashion that had shorter shelf life, that you bought a little bit closer, and then possibly that you had a really close supplier for things that you didn't really know whether this would sell well or not. But now more for security reason, and Yellen in the USA, she has said that, well, you should have also friendshoring. And that has nothing to do with geography, but you should be sure that you can have deliveries also if the geopolitical situation get more or get worse. So I think we'll see more of that, but there are very strong reasons to have trade globally, not least to avoid a lot of global friction, because we tend to learn from trading, and sometimes good to be dependent on each other. And we also have to see other areas of the world that has been outside the supply chains, say Africa and some other parts of the world. I'd like to see them develop, and if we suddenly say that we can only trade within Europe, within North America, within Asia, then of course it creates problems for those who are not really on board yet.
And you said it takes so long time to build a factory or a ship. Yeah, and it takes as long to build a seafarer or a master mariner.
Yeah, that's sometimes I look at the other industries, how long lead times they have. But in my industry, training people, we have really long lead times to develop teachers, new research that we want, at least if you take university education, and establish programs, and not least be attractive to the young generation to choose our professions.
That's my soapbox. I think that is connected to how we present ourselves as an industry. Who knows anything about the maritime industry outside our own little bubble? That's what I think has an impact on how young people, do they want to come here and work with us and see all the fantastic things that we can do, or that we do every day? And as long as we don't tell them, how can they find us?
Or even worse, we tell them a bad story, so to speak, if you have, say, lobbying. And that has actually changed a lot, as you asked before. Because in the beginning, when I entered this 15 years ago, it was a lot of complaining. We want this tax break, we want this, so we are almost running out of business. And then I think it was about 10 years ago, you had this recruitment campaign. And one student came up and said, well, I can read in the newspaper that you are all in trouble in shipping, so why should I put all my eggs in this basket for my future career? But I think it has changed a little bit. It's a little about the narrative. How do we show ourselves? And you do a great job, Lena, to show the good professions, so the good, interesting tasks that happen around shipping. Everything is not on board. And although we have been on board for a few years, there are other openings that come. So if we make the story that we will have only autonomous ships, I think that's very far into the future. But that will still require manpower for the system. But you might work on a transport chain level or law or anything around. It might not be that everyone has to be on board.
I think also the narrative now is, what can we contribute with to the society, instead of I need this and that. So that has changed as the industry has developed. But I've also been looking into this with ESG and environmental stuff. That's everyone is talking about that, and I'm always taking care of that or not. I don't know. But the S
if they don't, the national states will, because the citizens suffer from some of the effects at least.
Yeah, and the EU will probably. But I mean, the S and the G, the social side of everything, that is interesting. And you had a story to tell when I arrived here today when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Yes, it happened 1 or 2 years ago because, as I said earlier, that much of my profession is to sell projects, more or less. And I had a question from some female colleagues from a research institute, and they were sort of rigging this project, and they asked me to participate. I said, well, I'm part of many projects. Why don't you ask my colleague Marta instead? She's really good at these things. And I said, it's a little bit awkward, Johan, but we can't fulfill the requirements for gender equality if we need a man. So you feel yourself that you're now
fulfilling the quota.
Yes. Formal demands, we need a man. And that was really relieving after particularly studying at the University of Technology, doing my first steps of my research there. And that was really, and also had another at the National Transport Conference. I saw suddenly there were more Maria and Maria on stage than men in the panel. That was also a breakthrough.
How does it feel to be on the quota?
It's really good. We have progressed because I think that single gender environments is not that good. My wife, she's a midwife and she has a very single gender and they have all sorts of problems actually. So I think, and coming from a very male profession at the University of Technology, but I was also an officer in the reserve before, and that was of course very male at the time. But now I can see that we mix up much better now, and it's good. Logistics is actually rather gender balanced now, I would say.
Good, because as I read in the papers, to study logistics and to come into that world, there's a big demand for students, and there is a career to do there. So I think it's good that we are gender balanced in a way, neutral, I wouldn't say, but balanced, because then you feel at home when you come there. It's not only to feel like, well, maybe I'm welcome here, but also to feel the belonging into the group and being accepted for who you are. I think that is important for the young people. I'm just preparing a speech of recruitment, so that is why my thoughts are what the young people think and what they need for their fulfillment.
And that was actually something I noticed when moving from a University of Technology to a business school, that at Chalmers, you more or less recruited from half the population, and you also did research for half the society, the private sector, more or less. Whereas here, although being a business school, you think there would be more with single private firms and so on, but we are much better on seeing the other part of the Swedish economy, which is the public sector. And I think doing particularly transport, when you go down to the physical transport infrastructure and so on, then of course the public sector is much larger. And we can see in transport, very few companies are actually stock listed in Sweden. So they're either owned by government, Swedish or any other government, to public transport, rail, but also shipping, or it's very private, family-owned businesses. So it doesn't really, to change the industry, we can't rely on that the stock exchanges have that transparency, regulation, and their different code of conduct and so on. We need to do it a little bit differently in the transport sector.
So it's the finance, it's the capital they need.
Yeah, so one thing is that those providing the capital will have not last to make a risk assessment. If you're not behaving well, then you might run out of business actually. And if you're not doing good things in one part or as good as you can, then of course it's a big risk of lending money to that firm. So that might be hope. We run projects on how to finance the transition to fossil-free transport, and that's rather interesting research. It's possibly more on the land transport side, but also in maritime we need sort of charging systems and so on. Should that come from inside the maritime industry? Should it be the ports? Is it the energy companies? Is it public sector investments, or where will the money come from? We might know the solution, but who will take the risk of lending the money or even carrying the risks themselves?
So how do you see the future for the maritime industry?
Right now, I think it's a bit different from other, if we call it a recession or a crisis now. The difference is that, well, the same thing has happened before, that shipping has a long trough where a shortage of money, but those who have survived, if you're following the peak, you will have your pockets full of cash. And it's the same. Before it used to be the same as a farmer, a good harvest and a new John Deere tractor on the driveway. And of course, if you have a lot of cash, also attracting finance from banks and investors and so on, you buy too many ships and then it collapses. And of course, the pricing of any services, if there is an oversupply, you will dump the prices, particularly if you have a lot of fixed costs. But this time I don't see really the same investment. A few firms invest a lot in ships, but I see more like Maersk investing in vertical integration rather than horizontal, so buying logistics firms. We have seen Stena buy a forwarder that in turn has bought a truck haulier, so you can see that you integrate. You want to do more parts of the transport chain rather than buy more ships. I think also that, but particularly in the container segment, we've had a market concentration. So Maersk, if they have full pockets of cash now, they can't buy another shipping line because they will be too dominant and the competition or antitrust authorities will not allow it. Or they feel that the customers will not allow it because you don't want one too dominant player. Although MSC is big, but it has been so much concentration. So now I think you will diverse rather than buy more ships.
Is there a need for more ships? I mean,
what I've seen so far in the crisis has actually, my view is that there has been roughly enough ships to move. I mostly deal with liner shipping, but move the containers. There was enough ships, but we haven't had enough port capacity. So if you don't move the ship, if it lies outside a closed Chinese port or a congested San Pedro Bay port, then you need more ships. So I think when the supply chains start to work again, perhaps the recession is a bit of a relief if we don't buy as much for a while. There will be no more helicopter money sent to the population to sort out the recession. We will see. But I think it will slowly go back to normal, I think. But as we've seen from previous shocks or crises, that it will be a few turbulent years ahead, I think.
And more to research.
Yeah. So also that I had a little bit of media attention, but I think I'm on the short list of media calling someone when shipping doesn't work, call Johan. Because we've done projects before on this labor union conflict in the Port of Gothenburg and follow up with pandemic-related research and also other research. And now, interesting now is that we connect. I come from the side where we think we know the transport industry quite well, but I connected to other researchers at Chalmers who know manufacturing systems and those kind of supply chains much better. If we connect our research, I think we can learn very much. And I think that goes much for the industry as well. If ship owners know more about the design of the supply chains they serve, and if the supply chain managers know more of what transport can provide, then we can get much more efficient solutions.
Isn't it exciting that we live in this time and we are a part of it? I think so. So many things happening at the same time.
Yeah, and trying to master the width of this, you have to team up, of course. But the problem as a researcher is that what is expected from you is to dig a very deep hole to publish in the same journals, very detailed stuff. But someone has to look up of their hole sometimes and try to see the full pictures. So when I try to do that at least, and being a little bit curious, that I might grow out of that when I get even older, but you can't see my gray hair here in the podcast. But yeah, I think trying to connect things, that's what researchers should do. And von Humboldt's, his view of knowledge or Bildung, as it was called in German, it was to put the right question, not to get the right answer. That's sometimes the simple thing. But knowing much enough to have the right question, that's a trick.
I can relate to that when it comes to podcasting.
Yeah.
You need to know what to ask, because I'm not the interesting part. It's my guest that is the interesting part of this. Who do you think I should interview the next? Who would you be interested in listening to in the shipping podcast?
I think you should take one from the early stage of career. Say any of the student. What do you think of the future? How do you reason? That I think we can learn from that. And someone who is not having any stakes anymore, rather newly retired, but could be more open-minded and say, I've learned this from my long career and I think this was really bad. It's very difficult to say. It's difficult for me to question my own industry or profession too much, but also different to, I take my own conclusions after the data I collect and so on, of course. But when projects are selected, they are sometimes selected a little bit selectively, so to speak. So it's been a little bit more research in the middle, in the mainstream thing. It's more difficult to have the new visions and so on. But if you don't sit in a position where you rely on the next project or rely on that people will be open to be interviewed by you next time and so on, then you might be a little bit more open-minded. I hope I'm open-minded enough and I don't change my conclusions and so on, of course, but still you have to fit into a society and you have to do research that is relevant, but you can't challenge in all aspects at the same time. So someone newly retired, I would say, and someone about to embark on a career in shipping.
Okay.
You'll get the names later on.
Let's see what I can do about that. Thank you.
But I think you should try to find one of the main shippers. I know you have interviewed Per Bondemark, for instance, but some more, because I think many of the listeners are inside shipping, so to speak, and you need to hear the voices of those using the services a bit more, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I got some homework to do then. Thank you. Thank you, Johan, for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you.
This has been long coming, and I'm sorry that I didn't do it earlier. I know you have complained about that.
Yeah, I've been asking to be on this podcast for years now.
And now it happened.
Yes,
all
thank
of a
you,
sudden.
Lena.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Johan, for sharing so many insightful thoughts with us. I agree with you that we should all try and learn from each other. Sharing is caring. On that note, I would like to thank everyone who has reached out to me now and want to partner with the Shipping Podcast. I think there is a way for this podcast to contribute to the change needed. Let's see if I can find the same objectives somewhere else, as I'm a little bit fed up with doing this all on my own. Thank you for listening to this episode. The next one will focus on autonomous ships. So, until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a Shipping Podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.